Some letters arrived too late to be read, and yet they still managed to change everything. In a town where silence was considered strength, one envelope, long forgotten, will whisper a truth that refuses to stay buried. Where in the world are you tuning in from? What time is it for you right now? Let me know in the comments. Let's begin the story. The envelope that was never opened. The coastal mist clung low over the town of Seaford, like a memory reluctant to lift. Jessica Fletcher stepped off the small shuttle bus, her gloved hand tightening slightly around the handle of her weekend bag. It had been years since she'd last set foot in Seaford, and even then it had been for Marjorie's birthday, an afternoon of tea, laughter, and delicate restraint. Now it was a farewell. The Penwell Academy for Young Ladies had long since shuttered its doors, but the death of its headmistress, Marjorie Penwell, had drawn a scattered few of her former students and Jessica to the town that had once revolved around that school like a planet around a quiet sun. A modest memorial had been arranged by the local Heritage Society, timed conveniently to coincide with an estate auction of the school's contents. A greying man in a fisherman's jacket paused to tip his cap at her. "You're Mrs. Fletcher, aren't you? The writer knew you'd come." Jessica offered a warm but cautious smile. "Yes, Marjorie and I were friends for a very long time." He nodded but said no more, disappearing into the fog with a silent deference Jessica had come to associate with small towns and long memories. As she made her way toward the school's familiar iron gate, she noted the way the ivy clung stubbornly to the crumbling stone walls. Grief has a way of clinging too, she thought. Something in her bones tightened, not quite sadness, not quite foreboding, but something. The front hall smelled of dust and lavender, though both seemed reluctant to dominate. A few former students stood in pockets near the walls, some sipping lukewarm cider from paper cups, others thumbing through old photographs laid out for sentimental browsing. Laughter, where it existed, was low and brief, like the echo of something long extinguished. Jessica recognized a few faces. Frances Mallory, always immaculate and a touch aloof, spoke animatedly with one of the auction staff. Nearby, Alice Dunning lingered close to the grand staircase, her gaze fixed on a tarnished brass plaque that still bore Marjorie's name. There was a tension beneath the nostalgia, Jessica noted. Not the gentle melancholy of mourning, but a guardedness, as though certain memories were better left unprodded. "I wonder if Marjorie kept a list of who she hoped would come," Jessica said softly to Alice, who blinked as though waking from sleep. I imagine she did," Alice murmured. She was precise. "About everything." Jessica offered a small nod, then turned to look up the staircase. The varnish had dulled over time, but the steps themselves bore the same gentle creak. Marjorie had always walked them slowly, as though to remind the girls to tread carefully, in more ways than one. From somewhere upstairs a door clicked shut with a hollow finality. Later that afternoon, Jessica found herself wandering through the study Marjorie had once fiercely protected from the cleaning staff. The auctioneers, now tagging items for sale, had offered Jessica first refusal on anything she might want for remembrance. Her eyes settled on the writing desk, mahogany, slightly warped with time, its surface still bearing faint traces of ink, where Marjorie had written out decades of lesson plans and personal letters. Jessica brushed a fingertip across it, her expression softening. "Would you like to take it?" the auctioneer asked. "Marjorie listed your name under this one, said if you came it was meant for you." Jessica nodded slowly. "Yes, I think I would." With a quiet reverence, she opened the top drawer. Pencils, old address cards, a pressed violet between two yellowed receipts. Then in the back corner, tucked so far it might have gone unnoticed, she found the envelope. It was cream-colored, its edges curled just slightly. On the front, in Marjorie's neat hand, William Grayson. No return address, no stamp, sealed but never sent. Jessica stared at it for a long moment. Something about the name stirred a faint recognition she couldn't quite place. She turned it over, no date, no markings, until in the top right corner of the inner flap, she noticed something faint in pencil, March 1971. She pressed the envelope gently between her fingers, but didn't open it. Instead, she placed it in her handbag, with a quiet frown forming between her brows. Sometimes it was what we chose not to say that echoed the loudest. That evening, over weak coffee in the staff dining room, Jessica gently asked the question that had begun to needle her. "Does the name William Grayson mean anything to either of you?" she asked, glancing from Frances to another alumna seated nearby. Frances pursed her lips thoughtfully. "Grayson, no, can't say that it does. Was he a teacher?" "I'm not sure," Jessica replied, "but the name came up earlier in some of Marjorie's things." The other woman, Teresa Vaughan, tilted her head. "It does sound familiar, but I couldn't place a face to it. Wasn't there a groundskeeper years ago by that name? Or perhaps an artist?" Jessica offered a faint smile. "Possibly. I'd imagine someone who passed through, and quietly at that." Alice Dunning, who had been sitting a little apart with a crossword folded neatly in her lap, didn't speak, but her pencil had stopped moving. Jessica noticed there was something in the way people avoided a name, not out of ignorance, but discomfort, that told her more than a list of facts ever could. Outside the window, the fog had thickened again, curling around the lampposts like smoke. That night, back in her room at the small bed and breakfast overlooking the harbor, Jessica laid the envelope on the desk beside her notepad. A single lamp cast a soft circle of light, holding the letter like a quiet challenge, March 1971. But Marjorie's illness had begun in early 71. She had taken a brief sabbatical from the academy, citing exhaustion and personal matters. Jessica remembered the card she had received. Vague, but unusually short for Marjorie. Could the two events have been connected? She turned the envelope in her hands again. There was no glue bleed along the edges, no fingerprint smudges or scuffs to indicate it had been tampered with. It had simply waited. Jessica reached for her notebook and began jotting names: Marjorie, William Grayson, Alice Dunning, Frances Mallory. She drew a line between Marjorie and Grayson, then paused. The name still tugged at something, like the echo of a page half read. She tucked the envelope back into her handbag and moved to the window. The sea was black tonight, still and unreadable. Fog pressed against the glass like breath. Somewhere below, a foghorn groaned, a deep sorrowful sound that felt too fitting. Jessica wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders. There was something about that envelope, and about the way Alice's hand had hesitated mid-puzzle. Not fear exactly, but recognition. She couldn't yet name it. But she would, she always did. Jessica barely slept. Her thoughts lingered on the envelope like the taste of a question left unanswered. Morning brought no clarity, only a thick marine fog, and the dull clang of the harbor bell. She was seated in the breakfast room with a cup of tea cooling in her hands when the innkeeper, Mrs. Halberd, entered, looking pale. "Have you heard?" she whispered, as though afraid to awaken the wallpaper. "They've found a man, down by the lighthouse. Poor soul must have fallen over the cliffs." Jessica's heart dropped slightly. "Do they know who it was?" "William Grayson," Mrs. Halberd said with a breathless kind of solemnity. He was a quiet man, lived just outside town, did some handyman work. Kept to himself." Jessica set her cup down carefully. Her mind stirred, not with fear, but with a subtle acceleration of thought. "Was anyone with him?" "No." Sheriff Mort's down there now, poor man. Says it was the rain last night, slippery footing. Still, the lighthouse path's roped off for a reason. Jessica stood, the name echoing now with more than memory. William Grayson. The envelope. The coincidence seemed too precise. The cliffs at Seaford were notorious for their beauty and their danger. Locals avoided the lighthouse path, especially during storms. But William had been found there this morning, alone, beneath a ledge he should have known better than to scale. As she slipped on her coat, Jessica felt that quiet tightening in her chest again. Not panic, not yet, just the soft, unmistakable sensation of a puzzle beginning to form. Sheriff Mort met her with a familiar blend of wariness and respect. "I figured you'd turn up, Jessica," he said, not unkindly. As she approached the base of the lighthouse, the rocky bluff was cordoned off with a single sagging line of caution tape. "You say it was a fall?" Jessica asked gently. "Looks that way," Mort replied. "The path was slick last night. Fog rolled in fast, rain before midnight. Nothing suspicious, except," he scratched his temple, "something's bothering you too, isn't it?" "William Grayson," she murmured. "I found an unopened letter addressed to him yesterday. Among Marjorie Penwell's things." Mort raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Instead he led her toward William's small cottage not far from the cliffs. It was spare, tidy, and smelled faintly of turpentine and salt. Paintings lined the walls, studies of the coast, several half-finished portraits. Jessica's breath caught at one in particular. A woman seated by a window, her profile soft in the afternoon light, hair pinned in the style of another era. There was no signature, only a date, 3 weeks ago. "It's Marjorie," Jessica whispered. Mort nodded. "Seems so, and this is odd, too." He pointed toward a pair of boots by the door, dry, unscuffed. Jessica frowned. "He was found just after dawn, after last night's rain. And these boots are spotless." "Exactly." She approached the canvas again. There was care in the strokes, familiarity. Not obsession, something gentler. "Someone loved her," she said softly. Enough to remember the way light touched her cheek. But if William had painted this recently, why had Marjorie never mentioned him? And why would he walk alone into danger? Jessica folded her arms, the image of the envelope flickering behind her eyes like a lighthouse beam, steady, unresolved. The local library stood quiet and underused, the kind of place where whispers were unnecessary because everyone already knew not to speak. Jessica sat at the reference table, skimming through Old Town newsletters and donation logs. She found William's name sparsely, mostly attached to volunteer repair work. A donated fence here, a new coat of paint there. A quiet man, helpful, invisible. Mrs. Fletcher? The librarian, a woman in her 60s with a silver bob, approached tentatively. "Forgive me. I couldn't help overhearing you ask about Mr. Grayson." Jessica looked up with a soft smile. "Yes, I was hoping to understand more about him. He came in a few weeks ago," the woman said. "Asked about estate records. The Penwell Family Trust specifically." He seemed nervous, but very polite. Jessica's pen paused over her notepad. "Did he mention why?" "No, only that he believed something was owed to him. He didn't explain." Later that afternoon she stopped at the grocer's, where she ran into Harold Evans, a retired postmaster and lifelong Seaford resident. "William," he said, rubbing his chin. "Lately he wasn't quite himself. Folks said he talked about seeing someone from his past, said he was close to something, whatever that meant." "Did he mention a name?" Jessica asked. "No, ma'am. Just said she used to walk the cliffs, said he could still see her there." Jessica nodded, the quiet pieces arranging themselves. An envelope, a painting, an old school, and now a man chasing memory, perhaps too close to the edge. Jessica lingered in William's small cottage after the others had gone, the quiet hanging like a weight in the air. The morning light slanted across the wooden floorboards, catching dust that danced gently upward as she moved. Sheriff Mort had remained as well, crouched beside the wood-burning stove. "I thought I smelled something odd," he muttered, reaching in with the poker. From beneath a thin layer of ash, he pulled a partially charred sheet of paper, edges blackened, but the center spared by the uneven burn. Jessica bent down beside him, eyes narrowing. It was a letter, or had been. The handwriting, though smudged and faded, was unmistakably Marjorie's. Mort tilted it toward the light. "Looks like he tried to burn it, but didn't quite finish the job." Jessica read what she could. A phrase, "You have every right to know," and a date, March 1971. The same date as the envelope. Her breath caught slightly, though she said nothing at first. Why would William try to destroy a letter like this, unless he had read it? Unless it had brought more pain than clarity. "Something told him the truth," she murmured. "Or nearly enough of it." Mort nodded grimly. "Which means he didn't just fall. He was carrying something that made someone else nervous." Jessica stared into the stove. The ashes curled like paper regrets. And yet the fire hadn't consumed the whole letter. Some truths, it seemed, refused to disappear quietly. Later that afternoon, Jessica made her way to the municipal offices, where a harried assistant pointed her toward a private conference room. Elaine Mapes, Marjorie's estranged niece and the named executor of the Penwell estate, sat behind a cluttered desk, eyes sharp behind fashionable reading glasses. "Jessica Fletcher," she said, not bothering to rise. "I figured you'd come around. You always did like puzzles." Jessica offered a polite smile. "I'm more interested in clarity than games, Elaine. I understand you had a disagreement with William Grayson recently." Elaine sighed audibly. "Is that what this is about?" William was squatting. "Technically. The lighthouse is part of the old estate boundaries. He refused to vacate. Said Marjorie had promised it to him. No paperwork, of course." Jessica studied her. "And when did this conversation take place?" Elaine hesitated. "Last week. He was emotional, talking about being owed something. I reminded him there was no legal claim. It got heated, but not physical." Elaine looked affronted. "Please, I don't threaten people." Jessica glanced at a manila folder on the desk, pen scrawls across it. "A redevelopment survey for the lighthouse bluff. You're planning to sell the land." Elaine shrugged. "It's valuable, and I don't have the luxury of sentiment." Jessica's gaze lingered a moment longer. Elaine's tone was practical, but there was tension beneath it, like a violin string just a breath from snapping. Inheritance made people greedy, but it also made them afraid, especially if someone else had a hidden right to claim what they thought was theirs. That evening, back in her room, Jessica laid the sealed envelope on the nightstand once more. She had held it in her hands 3 times that day, and still it remained unopened, but not untouched. Everything pointed back to it now: the painting, the letter in the stove, William's inquiries into the Penwell Trust, Elaine's sudden urgency to liquidate the estate. Even William's cryptic remarks, recalled by the townspeople, seemed to circle a truth just out of reach. Jessica's mind returned to the phrase she'd seen on the scorched letter. "You have every right to know." It was a phrase one used when revealing a secret that had been hidden too long, not merely about affection, but perhaps something more structural: inheritance, bloodlines, names erased. She looked again at the date, March 1971. Marjorie had taken a sabbatical that year, citing fatigue, but Jessica remembered her absence had lasted longer than expected. Whispers among the faculty, unconfirmed of course, that she had gone away to recover. What had she returned from? Jessica reached for her notebook, her handwriting neat and steady as she listed. Letter never sent. William recently searching estate records. Elaine visibly nervous. Alice Dunning silent. She underlined the final name. Alice had gone pale when William was mentioned, not just startled, haunted. Jessica closed the notebook softly, her eyes drifting back to the envelope. It was no longer just a letter, it was the key. Jessica had always believed that the past never stayed buried, it merely waited for the right silence in which to whisper. That morning the parlor at Penwell Academy, hastily repurposed for tea and recollections, held the scent of steeped leaves and time-worn grievances. Jessica sat with Frances Mallory and Alice Dunning, both former students of Marjorie's, both carrying different versions of the same history. Frances, ever elegant, wore a pale scarf that matched the porcelain of her cup. "It's strange being back," she mused. "The place feels smaller, though perhaps that's just age catching up." Alice offered a tight smile, or memory stretching itself. Jessica sipped her tea, listening more than speaking. "Marjorie seemed to have touched each of you differently." Frances glanced toward the tall windows. She could be inspiring, or impossibly cold. It depended. Jessica turned slightly to Alice. "Did you keep in touch after graduation?" "Not really," Alice replied softly. "I sent a few letters, but Marjorie rarely replied. She wasn't the sentimental type." Frances laughed dryly. "No, she wasn't. She had her favorites though. That much was clear." Jessica caught the edge in her tone, resentment, subtle, but present. "I imagine being back here brings up all kinds of memories," she said. Frances set her cup down with care. "Not all of them pleasant." Alice's eyes flicked toward the staircase. "Some memories are better left where they belong." Jessica noted the moment of silence that followed. Fragile, charged. Beneath the civil exchanges, something else lived, wounded pride perhaps, or unfinished business. She tucked that thought away. Not everything painful was dramatic. Some truths wore lace gloves. The conversation shifted naturally, as such things do, toward the renovations and the upcoming estate auction. Jessica let it unfold before quietly steering it toward the name that had unsettled her for days. "I came across something curious in Marjorie's things," she said lightly. "A letter addressed to someone named William Grayson." Frances's expression remained neutral, but Jessica caught the blink, fractionally too long. "Grayson," Frances said slowly. "No, I don't believe I recall anyone by that name. Was he a teacher here, perhaps?" Jessica asked. Frances shook her head. "If he was, it would have been after my time." Jessica turned to Alice, who had gone very still. Her fingers brushed the side of her teacup, but she didn't lift it. "I'm not sure," Alice murmured. "It's a common enough name." Jessica leaned back slightly. The response wasn't false, but it wasn't quite honest, either. "It seemed odd," she said gently. "The letter wasn't mailed, it had been sealed, but left behind." Alice looked down. Perhaps Marjorie changed her mind. Frances let out a breath that passed for a laugh. Wouldn't be the first time she let something die in a drawer. There it was again, that bitterness. Sharpened by time, but still very much alive. Jessica studied their faces. The name had landed like a dropped coin, small but audible. Not fear, exactly, but the unease of recognition. Whatever had tied Marjorie and William together, it was not something the women wished to revisit, which only made Jessica more certain it needed to be. Later that day, Jessica wandered upstairs, drawn by instinct as much as by memory. The upper hallway, still lined with antique sconces and aging portraits of former headmistresses, held a quiet chill. Marjorie's private quarters had been left largely untouched, though the auction tags now fluttered from furniture like premature farewells. Jessica moved slowly, her hand brushing over the bookshelf beside the vanity. It was there, behind the framed poetry collection on the top shelf, that she noticed a small photograph tucked at an angle. She eased it out carefully. It was black and white, slightly curled at the edges. Marjorie stood beside a young man on a garden path, smiling, truly smiling. Her expression was softer than Jessica had ever seen it in person, her posture unguarded. The man beside her had a quiet strength about him, tall, broad-shouldered, slightly stooped forward, as though caught mid-laugh. He wasn't labeled, but Jessica knew. William Grayson. She studied the image, noting the intimacy in their stance. Not romantic necessarily, but close, familiar. Why would Marjorie hide this? Jessica turned the frame over. Nothing written, just a speck of old adhesive where it had once been secured in an album, or perhaps pinned to a board. Why conceal a photograph of someone who clearly meant something? Unless there had been regret, or loss, or something more dangerous, something that had consequences. She replaced the book with care, her mind circling the memory of that envelope. Perhaps it wasn't what was said in the letter that mattered most, but what had never been spoken aloud. The Seaford Library, nestled behind the post office, was a modest brick building with more memory than movement. Jessica had always appreciated the quiet reverence such places offered. Mrs. Calvert, the librarian, recognized her instantly and welcomed her inside with a gentle smile and a whisper. "I was wondering when you'd come by." Jessica returned the smile. "You always did keep track of who needed what, even before they asked." Mrs. Calvert glanced around, then lowered her voice. "I suppose you're asking about William." Jessica nodded. "Did he come here often?" "In recent months, yes, but not for books. He was researching property records, particularly the Penwell estate. Asked about land deeds, trust language, anything to do with inheritance." Jessica absorbed this in silence. "Did he say why?" "He claimed he had reason to believe he was owed something, but he never said more. Just that Marjorie had once made him a promise." Jessica's thoughts returned to the photograph. The way Marjorie had looked at William, not coldly, not as a schoolmistress, but as someone who had once trusted, perhaps even loved. Was he looking for proof? Jessica asked quietly. Mrs. Calvert hesitated. "I think he already had it. I think he just wanted to be acknowledged." Jessica thanked her, though the weight of the librarian's words stayed with her long after she stepped back into the afternoon sun. Not all debts were financial. Some were written in absence, in silence, and silence, she was beginning to suspect, had cost William Grayson more than he could bear. Later that afternoon, tucked in a storage cabinet behind the disused teacher's lounge, Jessica located the old financial ledgers of Penwell Academy. Bound in cracked green leather and smelling faintly of mildew, the records covered decades. She traced her finger along the columns for 1971, the year Marjorie had taken her sabbatical. There, listed quietly and without annotation, was an anonymous donation, $7,000, a significant amount for the time. No name, no address, just the word "private benefactor." Jessica turned the page slowly, mind already layering possibilities. William had disappeared from town that same year. Marjorie had withdrawn suddenly, citing health. And now a quiet infusion of money, untraceable, but timed too perfectly to ignore. Was it payment, compensation, or protection? Jessica wrote the number in her notebook. It wasn't proof, but it was a footprint. A sign that something had shifted beneath the polite facade of the academy that year. She glanced again at the column, her pencil tapping once against the page. Money, like memory, often left a residue, and sometimes it was the faintest ink that told the clearest story. Jessica found Alice alone in the garden, just before dusk, seated on the edge of a stone bench beneath the rose arbor. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, as though she were holding something invisible. "I remember him," she said quietly, before Jessica even spoke. Jessica sat beside her, letting the silence breathe. "He wasn't like the others. He didn't look through us. He saw us. He saw me." Jessica nodded gently. "Did Marjorie know?" "She knew everything," Alice whispered. "He protected me once, when I was young, when I had no one else. He never said a word about it, but he changed my life." Alice's voice trembled. "And now he's gone." Jessica reached over and placed a hand over hers. Some truths, she thought, didn't need to be shouted. They lived in gesture, in pain, in memory that had nowhere else to go, and perhaps in time, in justice. The portrait had been displayed only briefly, no more than a few hours in the modest town hall, where the Penwell Estates auction preview was underway, when it disappeared without a trace. Jessica stood beside the empty easel, the brass label beneath it still bearing the words, "Untitled Marjorie Penwell," in neat type. The staff buzzed anxiously behind her, and Sheriff Mort paced with an expression that straddled irritation and concern. "Did anyone even see who took it?" he asked aloud. "Not to anyone in particular. It's not a high-traffic room," the event coordinator replied nervously. "Most folks didn't come past the tea urn. But someone must have known it was here." Jessica studied the space with narrowed eyes. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken locks or discarded wrappings. Whoever took the painting had planned it, or at least known exactly what they were looking for. She thought again of the painting itself. William's brushstrokes had been unmistakable, tender, deliberate. Marjorie's likeness had been captured with the kind of intimacy that only comes from knowing someone deeply. To most it was simply a portrait. To someone else it might have been proof, not of guilt, but of history. Jessica's thoughts drifted back to Elaine Mapes and her sudden defensiveness about the estate, and to the strained glances between Frances and Alice. The painting hadn't vanished for its artistic merit. It had vanished because someone was afraid of what it confirmed, and perhaps even more afraid of what it might force them to admit. The next morning brought no answers, only accusations. Jessica was in the auction tent when Elaine Mapes arrived in a storm of clipped words and self-righteous energy. Her voice rose just enough to draw the attention of those nearby. "Alice Dunning stole that painting. I saw her near the room twice that afternoon, and now no one's seen her since." Jessica watched carefully, saying nothing at first. She had no reason to be near it. "She's been acting odd since she arrived. You know it," Elaine continued, directing her words toward Sheriff Mort. "She left a note at the B&B, Mort replied evenly. "Said she needed space." "That's not a crime." "Convenient," Elaine snapped. And just when questions start getting uncomfortable, Jessica stepped forward, her tone calm but firm. "Elaine, a painting doesn't vanish itself, but pointing fingers before we know the facts only deepens the damage." Elaine turned to her. "She had a reason, Jessica. She had a connection to William, and she didn't like that portrait being seen." Jessica met her eyes, or perhaps she understood exactly what it meant. Elaine faltered for just a second, then walked away briskly. Jessica remained thoughtful. Alice's disappearance wasn't proof of guilt, but it was a signal. People didn't flee because they were guilty. Sometimes they fled because they feared what the truth might require of them. Later that afternoon, Jessica paid a visit to the real estate office where the late William Grayson's modest coastal cottage was now listed among the available properties. "I understand you've already had an offer," she said gently to the clerk, who looked up from his calendar and gave a hesitant nod. "Yes, Mrs. Fletcher, from Francis Mallory in fact, came in the day after Mr. Grayson's death. Cash. Above appraisal." Jessica blinked, not in surprise, but in quiet confirmation. "Did she give a reason?" "She said it had sentimental value. Didn't elaborate." Moments later, Jessica found Francis seated on a bench near the shore, arms folded loosely, eyes distant. "I heard you tried to buy William's home," Jessica began, sitting beside her. Francis didn't look away from the horizon. "Is that a crime?" "No," Jessica replied gently. "But it is curious, especially so soon." Francis inhaled slowly. "I didn't know what he meant to her. Not fully. I thought maybe he loved her. Or maybe I was just a fool." Jessica watched her waiting. Francis turned at last. "When I was young, I adored him. He was kind, and older, and entirely unreachable. I thought if I had something of his, I'd understand why he chose Marjorie, or why she didn't choose me." Jessica offered no judgment, only a steady gaze. The answer was already there. Sometimes people bought houses, other times they bought ghosts. After her conversation with Francis, Jessica returned to Penwell Academy, her thoughts heavy with half-shaped truths. She asked the caretaker for a ladder and climbed into the attic above Marjorie's private quarters, a place seldom visited and never dusted. The air was thick with silence and cedar, and the sloped ceiling forced her to move carefully among stacks of boxed linens and crumbling records. She had no firm expectation of finding anything, but experience had taught her that secrets, like old letters, often gravitated upward. A wooden trunk in the corner caught her eye. Its lock had long since rusted. Jessica opened it slowly. Inside were mostly school records and keepsakes, neatly packed, until her fingers found something tucked between two hymnals, a thin cloth-bound volume. The first few pages were blank, but halfway through, Marjorie's handwriting emerged in faded ink. Jessica read slowly, her breath stilling. "I was 27. The silence was not strength, but fear. He asked me what I wanted. I told him to go. I didn't mean it. I never told the child. I never told him. The price of a reputation is a lifetime of quiet sorrow." Jessica sat back, the implications unfurling with quiet certainty. There had been a child. Marjorie had kept it secret from everyone. And William, could he have been the father or the child? The handwriting stopped abruptly, mid-sentence. The final page had a single line, scrawled, unedited. "One day someone will open what I sealed shut." Jessica closed the journal gently. The envelope had never been a message. It had been a confession. The following morning, Jessica accompanied Sheriff Mort down to the bluff beneath the lighthouse, a slope now cordoned off but walkable in dry weather. Mort had received an anonymous tip about discarded estate property near the cliffs. It didn't take long to find. Half buried in the soft soil, behind a patch of wind-stripped brush, lay the broken remains of a picture frame. Jessica crouched beside it. The brass label had been pried off, and the wooden edges splintered at the corners. No painting, just the husk. "Could have been tossed here last night," Mort muttered. "Or earlier. Heavy rains probably washed away any footprints." Jessica brushed away a layer of wet sand, revealing a faint trace of blue oil pigment on the inner bevel. "It's the frame from William's painting," she said quietly. Mort exhaled. "So much for stolen and resold." Jessica nodded. "It wasn't taken for value. It was destroyed to erase something. But even destruction left fingerprints, not on the object, perhaps, but on the psychology behind it. Who had been so desperate to silence what that painting represented? She stood slowly, eyes narrowing toward the curve of the cliff path above. William had died just feet from here, and now the painting that tied him to Marjorie, visually, emotionally, had been reduced to debris. Jessica didn't believe in coincidence, only in timing, and someone's timing, it seemed, was beginning to fray. Back at the inn, Jessica found Frances seated by the fireplace, staring into a book she clearly hadn't turned a page of in some time. "I found the frame," Jessica said gently, taking a seat beside her. "Buried behind the lighthouse." Frances didn't flinch, but the corners of her mouth tightened. "So, it's gone then?" "Good." "Why would that be good?" Jessica asked quietly. "Because it should never have existed," Frances snapped, then softened just as quickly. It was humiliating to know he thought of her that way. Still, after everything, Jessica studied her. "Frances, did you destroy the painting?" Frances shook her head. "No, but I wanted to. When I saw it, I felt like I was 17 again, ignored, invisible. I never mattered to her, Jessica. And he belonged to her in ways I couldn't understand." Jessica nodded, slowly. "And offering to buy his house?" Frances looked away. "I thought if I could own some part of his world, I could rewrite my role in it." Jessica didn't press further. Frances's pain was real, tangled not in guilt, but in the longing to matter. And longing, Jessica had learned, often made a better red herring than motive. She stood to leave but paused. Frances, William painted her, because he remembered her, but grief is not possession. Frances didn't reply. She didn't need to. The shame she carried had nothing to do with what she'd done, only with how little she felt she'd ever been seen. Jessica had placed the envelope on the small writing table in her room for days, unopened, untouched, yet always present. It sat like a silent witness to a story long buried. Now, as the sun dipped behind the harbor and the first shadows of evening crept along the floorboards, she finally broke the seal. The letter inside was handwritten in Marjorie's precise, unadorned script. There were no flourishes, no embellishments, only a quiet honesty that settled over the page like mist. "William, I meant to send this to you years ago. I meant to be brave. I wasn't. In the spring of 1971, I left Penwell for what I told others was illness. It was, but not of the body. I carried a child, ours. I gave birth in a home for unwed mothers under the name M. Pritchard. I was terrified, not of motherhood, but of losing everything I had built. The boy was placed in adoption. I told myself it was the best decision, that it was necessary. But I have lived with the ache of it every day since. I do not know if you remember our short time with the same weight I do. Perhaps not. But I owed you the truth. You have a son." Jessica folded the paper slowly, her fingers trembling not from shock, but from the magnitude of Marjorie's silence. She stood at the window and stared into the dusk. William had never received the letter, and yet, had he known all along? Jessica thought back to William's last weeks, the sudden inquiries into property rights, the painting of Marjorie completed mere weeks before his death, the unburned letter in the stove, and then there was Alice, a quiet girl once, a quiet woman now, who had remained strangely protective of both Marjorie and William, who had gone pale at the sound of William's name, who had vanished, briefly, just as tensions rose. Jessica returned to the school's archive room, where Alice had volunteered to help the auction staff sort records. The files were still spread across the desk. Birth records, employee rosters, estate inventories. She flipped through them with careful hands until she came across a marked folder dated 1971. Inside, a single note in Alice's handwriting: transferred to adoption agency, private request, in Pritchard. So Alice had found it. She must have shared it with William. Perhaps she thought he had a right to know. Perhaps she simply wanted the truth to breathe again. Jessica exhaled slowly. William had learned he was not just a quiet painter on the outskirts of someone else's story. He had been a father. But who else had learned what Alice had found? Jessica's thoughts darkened. The truth, once whispered, had a way of drawing attention, even from those who didn't want it spoken aloud, and fear had long been the school's hidden curriculum. Back at the inn, Jessica mulled over the chain of quiet revelations, how truths had begun to leak through cracks in Marjorie's carefully built facade. But she no longer believed that William had died by accident. Not entirely. Someone else had come close to the truth, or close enough to fear what it could mean. The painting had been destroyed not out of anger, but out of self-preservation. Elaine Mapes's urgency to sell the estate, her veiled anger, her accusations toward Alice, they now took on a sharper hue. Jessica reviewed the facts in her notebook. William's presence at the lighthouse, the confrontation with Elaine the week before his death, the hidden letter, the altered estate records. Elaine had everything to lose. If William had proven his connection to Marjorie, he might have had a legal right to claim a portion of the Penwell property, enough to derail the sale, disrupt the inheritance, and destroy the image of Penwell. Elaine had carefully curated. Jessica could imagine how the moment had unfolded. Perhaps William hadn't even meant to confront Elaine. Perhaps he had spoken out of hope or longing, and perhaps Elaine, in her panic, had only meant to frighten him. But on wet cliffs and brittle pride, it didn't take much for fear to become fatal. Jessica stood, her mind already preparing what she needed to say, and to whom. Truth wasn't the enemy, it was the silence that followed it. The sitting room of the inn had been cleared for evening tea, but Jessica asked that the lights remain low. A single candle flickered on the mantel, casting soft shadows across the faces gathered there. Frances, Alice, Elaine, and Sheriff Mort. "I asked you here," Jessica began, "because William Grayson did not die simply from a slip of the foot. He died from the weight of something far older." Elaine shifted in her chair, but Jessica held her gaze. Marjorie wrote a letter to William. She never sent it. In it she confessed to having had a child with him, a son placed in adoption to protect her position. That letter remained unopened for decades. She paused. William found the truth another way. He came to the school, he saw the records, and he likely told someone. Jessica turned now to Alice, who sat with her hands folded tightly. "You helped him, you showed him what he had a right to know, and someone else heard it." Elaine stood sharply. "You think I think you panicked," Jessica said gently. "You feared what a claim like his would do to the estate, to your inheritance. You met him at the lighthouse, perhaps to warn him off, but it was wet and slippery, and you never meant for him to fall, did you?" Elaine's lips parted. For a moment she looked like a child caught in a lie that had grown too big to hold. "No," she whispered. "I didn't mean—" He stepped back. "I only wanted him to leave." Silence settled, and in it, Jessica felt not triumph, but sorrow, because it had never been murder by malice. Only a tragedy born of truths too long kept hidden. The final piece came quietly. While returning the school records to their archival box, Jessica noticed a hollowed-out poetry volume on the shelf, a Shropshire Lad, its spine heavier than expected. Inside, tucked between its pages, was a sealed file, the official adoption certificate, signed under Marjorie's pseudonym. William's name had been added in pencil, almost as an afterthought. Jessica closed the book softly. Some secrets were buried not to be lost, but to be protected, until the world was ready to receive them. And though it had come too late for William, the truth had at last found its page. The candlelight from the inn's sitting room had long since gone out. Jessica found Alice seated on the narrow bench behind the rose arbor, her silhouette curved slightly inward, as if sheltering something fragile. Jessica sat beside her, careful not to rush the silence. "I knew you'd come," Alice said at last. Her voice was low but steady. "I couldn't keep it to myself." Jessica folded her hands in her lap. "You showed William the letter." Alice nodded. "He didn't know everything. Not the adoption file, not Marjorie's journal, but I'd found the envelope tucked into that drawer. I wasn't supposed to look, I know that, but I did, and I knew it was his name." Jessica's voice was soft. "What made you show him?" Alice looked out at the hedgerow, the edge of her expression lit by the glow from the inn's rear window. "Because he looked lost. Like he was standing next to a door he didn't even know belonged to him. I thought maybe it would open something good, a reconciliation, a kind of healing." Jessica's thoughts stirred. The motivations made perfect sense. Not criminal, not dramatic, just human. "He said very little after he read it," Alice continued. "Just that he needed to think. He thanked me, and then someone else found out." Jessica said quietly. Alice's hands tightened. "I never told anyone, I swear." Jessica laid a hand gently on hers, but someone overheard. The wind rustled low across the leaves, and Jessica felt the shape of the final truth settling in. Not a conspiracy, not even betrayal, just fear, eavesdropping, and timing. Back in her room, Jessica stared out toward the lighthouse. The wind had picked up again, tossing the sea to faint froth. From this distance the bluff looked deceptively serene. But Jessica's thoughts were anything but. She thought of Alice's whisper in the dark, of William's quiet departure from the school archives, of the way Elaine's voice had cracked, not in rage, but in panic. It came to her in a pattern, a memory of a sentence overheard earlier in the week, when Elaine had said, "I went looking for her after dinner, thought I saw Alice slip away toward the cliffs," and that's when it clicked. Elaine had followed, not to spy, not to scheme, but perhaps simply out of suspicion, or worry, or curiosity poorly timed. If she had heard enough, if she'd realized that William might have a claim, not just to memory, but to Marjorie's estate, it would have terrified her. Jessica returned to her notebook. She flipped back to the page where she'd listed everyone's whereabouts that night. The only one unaccounted for, just before the storm began, had been Elaine, and the lighthouse path, slick with rain, unguarded. Elaine had been there. Jessica wasn't ready to accuse, not yet, but fear left its own kind of evidence. It echoed not in footprints, but in broken decisions and silence too long held. Elaine was in the town archives when Jessica found her, ostensibly sorting through a collection of school memorabilia, though her hands trembled slightly as she placed old photographs into their sleeves. Jessica stood in the doorway for a moment before speaking. "I think you went to the lighthouse the night William died." Elaine looked up sharply. "I was at the inn." Jessica stepped inside, her tone gentle but firm. "You followed Alice. You heard enough to make you nervous. You went to confront William." Elaine turned away, her fingers tightening on the edge of a storage box. "He said he was going to take what was his, that he'd waited long enough. What was I supposed to do, just hand over my aunt's legacy?" Jessica said nothing. Elaine turned back, her voice cracking. "He wasn't angry. That's what made it worse. He was calm, kind, said he didn't want money, just acknowledgement." She took a breath. "I told him to leave, that he was causing trouble, and then it started raining, and he turned to go. He said something, she never meant to hurt anyone, and then his foot slipped." Elaine swallowed hard. I didn't push him. I didn't touch him. Jessica nodded slowly. But you didn't call for help either. Elaine's eyes shimmered. He was still, so still, and I told myself maybe it was fate. That maybe if I left it alone, it would all go away. Jessica didn't judge. She only listened. It wasn't cruelty that had taken William's life. It was fear and silence. The same silence that had kept a letter locked for 30 years. Jessica didn't report Elaine that night. Instead, she invited her to walk with her down the hill behind the inn where the sea could be heard washing softly against the rocks. They walked for some time before either of them spoke. "It's a strange thing," Jessica said at last.
Distance.
"What fear does to people, it doesn't always scream. Sometimes it just folds its hands and closes a door." Elaine said nothing. "You didn't set out to hurt him," Jessica continued, "but the choices we make even in panic still shape the outcome. That painting, that letter, William himself, they weren't threats. They were truths waiting for space." Elaine's voice was a whisper. "I wasn't ready to lose everything." "Were you ready to carry it?" Jessica asked gently. "Because you have been." Elaine turned to her, tears not yet shed tightening her eyes. "What do I do?" Jessica took a breath. "You tell the truth.
Distance.
The part that's yours to tell. You come forward, not because it clears your name, but because it honors his." Elaine looked out at the sea, her arms folded tight, then slowly she nodded. Jessica said no more. Some confessions needed no witness but the night.
Distance.
And some wrongs could only be set right by walking toward them, not away. In the days that followed, the news of Elaine's statement spread through Seaford with the weight of both shock and relief.
Distance.
There was no formal trial, only a signed account, a decision not to contest culpability, and a quiet acknowledgement of negligence. Elaine surrendered her stake in the estate, opting instead for anonymity and quiet work elsewhere. But the town remembered. Not the scandal, but the tragedy.
Distance.
They remembered William, who had lived quietly on the edge of things. Marjorie, who had raised generations of girls while burying her own past. And the painting, now only a memory, which had once dared to speak what no one else would. At the Seaford Library, the staff mounted a small plaque in the local history room with a simple inscription: "To those whose stories were never told, your truth mattered." Jessica stood before it one afternoon, her hands folded in front of her, her eyes wet with something softer than sadness. Not closure, perhaps, but grace. Jessica stood beside Sheriff Mort on the inn's front porch, the sea in the distance humming its endless refrain. "I suppose it wasn't really about the fall," he said. "No," Jessica replied. "It never is." She looked out across the bay. "The tragedy wasn't in what happened at the cliff," she said softly. "It was in everything that was never said before it." She held the unopened letter again in her hand. Not to read, but to remember. Some truths arrive late. But when they do, they ask only one thing: that we finally listen. Back in Cabot Cove, Jessica sat at her writing desk, the window open to the soft rush of waves against the rocks below. The envelope now lay beside her notebook, not for analysis, not for evidence, but for remembrance. She had carried it home in the inside flap of her suitcase, not because it belonged to her, but because, in some strange way, it belonged to no one else. Its words had already done their work. They had unraveled a silence and given voice to a life long denied. She turned to the page she was writing. The working title read, "The Letter That Was Never Opened." Not a mystery, not exactly, more a meditation on time, on fear, and on the cost of keeping love secret. As her pen moved, Jessica thought not of Marjorie the headmistress, but of Marjorie the woman, the one who had known passion, made mistakes, and chosen silence over scandal because she believed that silence was strength. But Jessica saw it differently now. Marjorie hadn't protected her legacy. She had delayed its redemption. She paused, her pen hovering over the paper. Some letters, she wrote, are never delivered, not because they weren't meant to be read, but because they required courage on both ends. She looked again at the envelope, its edges now worn from time and touch. It had crossed decades and deaths to reach its meaning, and in the end, it had not failed. It had simply waited. 2 weeks later, Jessica returned briefly to Seaford to attend the rededication of the local history wing at the library. It was modest, no banners, no speeches, but in its quietness, it felt precisely right. The recovered portrait of Marjorie Penwell, the one William Grayson had painted with such reverence, now hung on the east wall beside portraits of the town's early founders and benefactors. The new plaque beneath it read, "Marjorie Penwell, Educator, Mother, Memory." Jessica stood before it longer than most, letting her gaze trace the familiar softness in Marjorie's face. The brushwork was not flawless. William had painted not with precision, but with feeling. Every line was an act of remembrance. She noted the careful restoration, the frame repaired, the canvas smoothed but not retouched. It remained honest, nothing hidden, nothing erased. Francis had arranged for its recovery, donating the funds anonymously, though Jessica suspected most in town knew, and no one questioned its presence. It was no longer evidence, it was history. Jessica turned to leave, and caught the eye of the librarian, who offered a simple nod. No one spoke of the scandal that had dissolved like fog. What remained was the painting, and in it, the truth. Sometimes a legacy isn't rewritten. Sometimes it's just finally seen for what it was all along. Seaford had always prided itself on endurance. A fishing town, a school town, a place where people learned to bear things quietly. But even here the aftershocks of truth had their ripple. Alice Dunning returned to her community work at the library, cataloguing oral histories and training the new volunteers. Her presence, once delicate, now carried something steadier. Jessica saw her at the memorial wing that day, gently guiding a young boy through the exhibits. She'd said little since the night of the confession, but she didn't need to. Her silence no longer carried fear. Frances Mallory, ever poised, had stepped back from her usual social circle. She declined invitations now, not out of shame, but for space. Jessica later heard she had quietly established a scholarship fund in William's name for aspiring local artists. No ceremony, no press. Jessica had written her a letter of her own, a brief note of thanks. Frances never replied, but sometimes gratitude is best received without response. And Elaine Mapes, once so tightly coiled with pride and fear, had left Seaford altogether. She'd issued a statement to the town council, relinquishing her claim to the Penwell estate. Word had it she moved north, into a small cottage near a lake. Mort told Jessica she'd been volunteering at a hospice center. People do strange things with guilt. Jessica had said, but sometimes if they're lucky, they do honest things with it too. The town didn't forget, but it forgave in its own way. And forgiveness, Jessica thought, was never louder than when it was quiet. Toward the back of the Seaford Library, behind the genealogy archives and beside the glass case holding early maps of the town, a new item had been placed on quiet display. The envelope, framed in a floating mount, its yellowed paper preserved but unaltered, the wax seal still visible though broken. Beside it, a small placard read, the letter Marjorie Penwell never sent. Found in her personal effects, donated anonymously, displayed with permission. Jessica visited it alone, near closing time when the library was at its stillest. She read the plaque again, though she already knew its words by heart. What moved her wasn't the paper or the handwriting. It was the act of placing it here, not hidden in a file, not destroyed, but preserved in full view. Not as evidence. As acknowledgement. A few visitors had passed by earlier and looked at it curiously. One had whispered to the other, "Why would anyone put a letter on display?" Jessica had smiled to herself, because she thought, some letters aren't meant to be read privately. They're meant to stand as reminders. That time does not erase the need for truth. It only delays the courage it takes to tell it. Later that evening, back in Cabot Cove, Jessica returned to her desk. Rain tapped gently against the window pane, and the smell of old paper and ink wrapped around her like a shawl. She opened her journal, not to write the story anew, but to end it properly, not with finality, but with understanding. Some stories don't begin with a crime. They begin with a choice, and the effects of that choice ripple outward, carried by time and silence, until they find someone willing to listen. Marjorie was a woman who gave everything to her profession. But in doing so she gave up something too, her voice. William, kind and quiet, had waited for hers until it was too late to answer. And yet, even silence carries a kind of truth, if one is willing to sit with it long enough. Jessica paused, her pen still. The letter that was never opened became, in the end, a letter that was never forgotten. And perhaps that's what matters most. She set her pen down and closed the notebook. The rain had stopped. In the hush that followed, she heard no voice, no echo, only the quiet reassurance that what was hidden had finally been seen, and that sometimes justice is not a verdict or a sentence. It's simply letting the truth stand, unfolded, unashamed, waiting, as all truths do, for someone brave enough to read it. Some truths don't arrive with fanfare or fury. They slip in quietly, like the tide at dusk, touching everything before fading back into silence. But tell me, do you believe the real crime was the fall that ended a life, or the silence that lasted decades too long? I'd love to hear what you think. Share your thoughts and theories in the comments below. And if this mystery lingered with you, feel free to like the story, pass it along to someone who enjoys quiet revelations, and subscribe for more tales where the truth is never quite what it seems.